Within 30 minutes, rattlesnake venom can turn blood into poison. That morning, a wife had to choose trust a doctor 2 hours away, or an Apache woman with medicine everyone feared. Who would you believe? The September sun hung 3 fingers above the mesa when Martha heard the rattler's warning too late. She was hanging wash behind their adobe house, thinking about the empty larder and Thomas's promise to ride to Socorro for supplies. The snake struck before she could step back, its fangs finding the soft leather of her husband's boot as he rounded the corner with an armload of mesquite. "Jesus and Mary," Thomas breathed, dropping the wood. The rattler coiled and struck again, this time catching his ankle above the boot line. He stumbled backward, his face already pale with shock. Martha grabbed the iron poker from beside the outdoor fire pit. The snake writhed away into the sage, but the damage was done. 2 sets of puncture marks wept blood through the torn cotton of Thomas's sock. "Get me inside," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Send Joaquin for Doc Henley." She helped him hobble through their door, noting how the church bell was striking 9 later than usual for old Father Miguel's morning prayers. Thomas collapsed onto their rope bed, and she pulled off his boot to examine the wounds. Already the flesh around the bite was swelling, taking on an ugly purple hue. "Joaquin!" she called to their neighbor's boy, who was leading goats past their fence. "Ride fast to Mesilla, bring the doctor! Ride fast to Mesilla, bring the doctor!" Socorro was where Thomas had promised to fetch supplies, but Mesilla was closer and held the only physician for 50 miles. The boy nodded and spurred his burro toward the main road. Martha returned to Thomas, who was now shivering despite the warm morning. She cleaned the wounds with whiskey from their dwindling bottle and tried to remember what her mother had taught her about snakebite. Tourniquet? No, that was for bleeding. Ice? They had none. "How long does Joaquin need to reach town?" Thomas asked, gripping her hand. 2 hours there, 2 back, if he finds the doctor quickly. Martha pressed a damp cloth to his forehead. "You'll be fine. Doc Henley has that new medicine from back east." But even as she spoke the words, she noticed how Thomas's breathing had grown shallow, how his pupils seemed larger than they should be. The venom was working fast. Outside, clouds gathered above the Oregon mountains, promising the kind of late summer storm that could wash out the creek crossing, if Joaquin couldn't make it back before the water rose. Martha folded her hands around her husband's burning fingers and listened for hoofbeats on the road. By noon the swelling had spread halfway up Thomas's leg, and his skin felt hot enough to fry an egg. Martha had torn strips from her best petticoat to wrap the wound, but she could see the dark lines of poison spreading beneath his skin like ink in water. "Where's that boy with the doctor?" Thomas muttered, his words slurred. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the chills that made him shake the entire bed frame. Martha stepped onto their small porch and shaded her eyes against the sun. The road to Mesilla stretched empty in both directions, heat waves rising from the packed earth. Storm clouds had thickened over the mountains, and she could smell rain on the wind. "Maybe they stopped to wait out the weather," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "You know how these September storms can be." A movement caught her eye near the old cottonwood by their well. An Apache woman sat in the shade, her back straight as a fence post. Martha had seen her before at the trading post in Mesilla, where she sold beautiful silver work to the Mexican families. The woman's graying hair was braided with blue beads, and her cotton dress was trade store cloth over traditional moccasins. The woman met Martha's gaze, and stood, approaching the porch with careful steps. "Your husband," she said in accented English. "Snake medicine." Martha's hand found the porch rail. She'd heard the stories, Apache knowledge of desert plants that could heal or kill, remedies passed down through generations of surviving in this harsh country. But she'd also heard other stories about settlers who trusted the wrong medicine and paid with their lives. "The doctor's coming," Martha said. "From Mesilla." The woman nodded toward the darkening sky. "Storm comes first. Water rises." She reached into a leather pouch at her waist and withdrew a bundle of dried herbs. "Snake root. Draws poison." From inside the house came the sound of Thomas retching, his body rejecting the little water she'd managed to get him to drink. The church bell chimed 12 times, each note seeming to echo her husband's labored breathing. Martha looked from the empty road to the Apache woman's weathered hands, steady as stone. Time was running out, and the storm clouds promised to make her choice for her if she waited much longer. "What do you need me to do?" she heard herself ask. The Apache woman's name was Elena, and her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this ritual many times before. She knelt beside Thomas's bed and unwrapped her bundle of medicines, dried roots, sage, something that looked like ground bone, and a small clay pot that smelled of pine resin. "Water," Elena said. "Clean. From your well." Martha hurried outside with their wooden bucket. The wind was picking up, sending dust devils skittering across their yard. To the west she could see curtains of rain already falling in the mountains. If Joaquin and Doc Henley were caught in that weather, the creek would be impassable for hours. When she returned, Elena had begun grinding the snake root between two smooth stones. The sound was rhythmic, almost like prayer, and somehow it seemed to calm Thomas's ragged breathing. "My grandmother taught me," Elena said without looking up. "Snake people are old enemies. We know their medicine." She mixed the ground root with water from Martha's bucket, creating a thick paste that she spread on a clean cloth. The mixture smelled earthy and bitter, like the desert after rain. "This draws poison out through skin," Elena explained, applying the poultice to the swollen flesh around the bite marks. But inside, medicine also needed. From her leather pouch she withdrew a small bundle of dried leaves and began steeping them in hot water from Martha's kettle. The tea that resulted was dark brown and smelled strongly of sage and something Martha couldn't identify. "He drinks this," Helena said. "Little sips, every few minutes." Martha supported Thomas's head while Elena tipped the cup to his lips. He grimaced at the bitter taste but swallowed, then lay back with a shuddering breath. "How long?" Martha asked. Elena pressed her ear to Thomas's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Medicine works slow. Poison fights back. Maybe sunrise, maybe." She didn't finish the sentence. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows. Martha realized she was holding her breath, watching her husband's face for any sign of improvement. His cheeks were still flushed with fever, but she thought his breathing might be slightly easier. Outside, the storm arrived in earnest, drumming against their roof and turning their yard into a muddy river. The road to Masilla would be impossible now. Whatever happened, they were committed to Elena's medicine. Martha reached for her husband's hand and felt for his pulse, still rapid, but perhaps not quite as thready as before. She caught Elena's eye across the bed, and the Apache woman nodded slightly. "We wait," Elena said, "and watch." The storm raged through the afternoon, turning their small house into an island surrounded by rushing water. Martha had dragged their kitchen table beside the bed so Elena could lay out her medicines properly, roots and leaves arranged in careful patterns, each with its own purpose in the healing ritual. Every 30 minutes Elena prepared a fresh poultice for the bite wounds. Martha watched the Apache woman work, noting how she tested each mixture on her own wrist first, checking the temperature and consistency. There was nothing careless about Elena's methods. Every gesture spoke of knowledge earned through years of practice. "The swelling?" Martha said, as Elena unwrapped the old bandage. "It looks." "Less," Elena confirmed. "Poison moving out, but fever still fights." Thomas had grown quieter as the afternoon wore on, his mumbled complaints giving way to deep, exhausted sleep. Martha found this silence more frightening than his earlier groaning. She pressed her hand to his chest and felt the rapid flutter of his heart beneath her palm. Elena mixed a new batch of bitter tea and woke Thomas just enough to get him to swallow a few sips. His eyes opened briefly, unfocused but aware enough to squeeze Martha's fingers. "Doc coming?" he whispered. Soon Martha lied. Through the window she could see that their yard had become a lake, with only the tops of their fence posts visible above the muddy water. No one would be traveling tonight. Elena began to hum softly, as she worked not a song Martha recognized, but something that seemed to match the rhythm of the rain on their roof. The Apache woman's voice was surprisingly sweet, and Martha found herself matching her breathing to the melody. "Your grandmother," Martha said during a quiet moment, "she was a healer?" Elena nodded, her hands never pausing in their grinding of fresh snake root. "Many women in my family. Plant knowledge passes mother to daughter, like your people pass reading and writing. Where did you learn English? Mission school, long time ago, before the soldiers came to Canyon de Chelly. Elena's voice carried old sadness. My husband wanted our children to know both worlds. White world, too, for trading. Martha realized she was seeing Elena not as the mysterious Apache from stories, but as simply another woman trying to make the best of difficult circumstances. Someone who understood about keeping a family together, about the weight of decisions that could save or doom the people you loved. The church bell chimed 6 times, muffled by the storm. Thomas stirred and opened his eyes, focusing on Martha's face with more clarity than she'd seen since morning. "Water," he said, and his voice was stronger. Elena smiled for the first time since arriving. Good sign, poison weakening. As Martha helped Thomas drink, she noticed that the dark line spreading up his leg had stopped advancing. The flesh around the bite marks was still swollen and discolored, but the angry purple had faded to a more natural bruising. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, though water still rushed past their windows. Martha realized she was no longer listening for hoofbeats on the road. Whatever Doc Henley might have done with his modern medicines, Elena's ancient knowledge was already working. She caught the Apache woman's eye and mouthed a silent thank you. Elena simply nodded and returned to grinding herbs, her weathered hands steady as stone. By evening the fever had broken. Thomas slept peacefully for the first time since the snake bite, his breathing deep and regular. The swelling in his leg had begun to subside, and when Elena changed the poultice, Martha could see that the wound was already beginning to heal. "He will live," Elena said, settling back in the chair Martha had brought from their kitchen. "But weak for many days. Poison leaves body slow." Martha felt tears of relief sting her eyes. She had been so focused on the immediate crisis that she hadn't allowed herself to truly consider what losing Thomas would mean. The ranch they were still paying for, the cattle that needed tending, the sheer impossibility of a woman alone in this country. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "Or, what do you charge? For the medicine?" Eleanor looked surprised by the question. "Charge? Number? You gave water from your well when I was thirsty. You spoke to me like a person, not like ghost to be feared." She paused, looking at Thomas's sleeping form. "White people, they see Apache. They see only stories from newspapers, war parties and raids. They don't see women who know healing, who want their children to live in peace." Martha realized it was true. She had approached Elena with the same wary caution she might show a dangerous animal, not recognizing the irony that she was the one asking for help. "Joaquin should have been back by now," Martha said, listening to the diminishing rain. "Unless the creek is still too high to cross." "Doctor would bleed him," Elena said matter-of-factly. "Take out good blood with bad, make him weaker." She touched the clay pot that held her pine resin salve. "Plants know what blood needs. Roots draw poison, leaves clean wound, bark stops fever, all working together." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard hoofbeats splashing through the mud outside. Martha looked through the window and saw 2 riders approaching Joaquin on his burro, and an older man in a black coat who could only be Doc Henley. Martha stepped onto the porch as the men dismounted. Doc Henley was a thin, bearded man with kind eyes and mud-splattered clothes. His leather medical bag was strapped carefully behind his saddle, protected from the rain by oiled canvas. "Mrs. Henley," he said, tipping his hat. "Young Joaquin here tells me your husband took a rattlesnake bite. I came as soon as the creek was passable." "He's better," Martha said. "The fever broke an hour ago." Doc Henley's eyebrows rose. "Better? Ma'am, with respect to rattlesnake bite this morning, should still have your husband fighting for his life. May I see him?" Martha led the doctor inside, aware of Elena rising respectfully from her chair. Doc Henley nodded politely to the Apache woman, his gaze taking in the array of plant medicines on the table. He examined Thomas carefully, checking his pulse, lifting his eyelids to peer at his pupils, unwrapping Elena's latest poultice to inspect the bite wounds. Martha watched his face, seeing professional surprise replace skepticism. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The inflammation is minimal, and there's no sign of systemic poisoning. His heartbeat is strong and regular. He looked up at Martha. "What treatment did you apply?" Martha glanced at Elena, who nodded slightly. "Elena, here," Martha said. "She knows plant medicine, snake root and other things." Doc Henley turned to Elena with new interest. "Snake root? Echinacea purpurea? And what else willow bark for the fever?" Elena seemed surprised by his botanical knowledge. "Snake root, yes. Also osha root, desert sage, pine pitch." She pointed to each bundle in turn. "And tea from desert willow." "Fascinating," Doc Henley said. "I've read about these applications in some of the new medical journals. There's growing interest in traditional remedies. Some physicians back east are beginning to study native treatments more seriously." He reached into his medical bag and withdrew a small brown bottle. "I brought a trial serum from El Paso, one of those experimental preparations the medical journals are buzzing about. But, truth be told, what you've already done here may be just as effective." He handed the bottle to Martha. "Keep this in case of future emergencies, but I think your husband is past the worst danger." Elena began packing her medicines, clearly preparing to leave. Martha caught her arm gently. "Please," Martha said, "stay for supper at least. It's too late to travel safely." Elena hesitated, glancing at Doc Henley. The doctor smiled. "I'd be honored to share a meal," he said, "and perhaps Elena would be willing to tell me more about desert plant medicine. I'm always eager to learn." As Martha began preparing what food they had, she noticed how the conversation between Elena and Doc Henley gradually warmed from professional courtesy to genuine scientific discussion. Elena described how different plants worked together to treat various ailments, while Doc Henley explained some of the new theories about how the body fought infection and fever. Thomas woke briefly during supper, clear-eyed and asking for food, the first appetite he'd shown all day. As Martha fed him spoonfuls of broth, she realized that something had shifted in their small house. Elena was no longer the mysterious Apache stranger. She was simply another woman with valuable knowledge, sharing a meal with friends who respected her skills. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, revealing the first stars. The crisis had passed, but Martha sensed that the connections forged in those anxious hours would outlast the emergency that created them. "Elena," she said as the Apache woman prepared to leave, "you'll always be welcome here, for any reason." Elena smiled and pressed something into Martha's hand, a small bundle of snake root wrapped in soft leather. "Keep this," she said, "just in case." Martha watched Elena walk into the starlight, her silver bracelets glinting as she mounted her horse. Tomorrow would bring the ordinary challenges of ranch life, but tonight had proven that survival sometimes depended on being willing to trust knowledge that came from unexpected sources. She turned back to her husband, sleeping peacefully in their bed, and realized that Elena's medicine had healed more than just a snakebite. It had shown her a different way of seeing the world, one where wisdom could come from any direction, and healing was possible if you were brave enough to accept help when it was offered. 3 weeks later, Thomas was back on his feet and strong enough to ride to Socorro for the supplies they still needed. The bite marks had healed to small white scars, and the only lasting effect was a slight stiffness in his ankle on cold mornings. Martha had seen Elena twice more once, at the trading post in Mesilla, where they exchanged polite greetings, and Elena asked after Thomas's health, and once when Elena brought her daughter to trade silver jewelry for winter cloth. Both times Martha felt the quiet satisfaction of a friendship that had been tested and proven genuine. Doc Henley had stopped by the week before to check on Thomas's recovery. He'd brought a medical journal from back east that discussed traditional remedies, and he'd asked Martha to give it to Elena the next time she saw her. "There's more wisdom in that woman's little finger than in half the medical schools I know," he'd said. "I just hope more doctors will start recognizing that healing comes in many forms." Now, as Martha hung laundry in the same spot where the whole crisis had begun, she thought about how differently things might have gone. If she had refused Elena's help out of fear or prejudice, Thomas might not have survived the night. If Elena hadn't been willing to trust a frightened white woman with ancient knowledge, a good man would have died needlessly. She folded Thomas's mended shirt and placed it in her basket, then looked toward the old cottonwood by their well. Sometimes, when the wind was right, she could hear the faint sound of Elena's humming carried on the desert air, the same rhythm she had used while grinding medicine and keeping vigil through that long, storm-filled night. The Apache had blown medicine and held her heartbeat, as the old stories said. But more than that, Elena had shown her that healing was possible when people were willing to see past their fears and recognize the wisdom that lived in unexpected places. Martha picked up her laundry basket and walked back to the house, where Thomas was mending harness leather on their front porch. He looked up as she approached and smiled the same smile that had convinced her to marry him and follow him to this harsh, beautiful country. "Everything ready for the trip to Socorro?" she asked. "Just about," he said, testing the strength of a repaired rein. "Though I was thinking maybe we should stop by the trading post first. See if Elena has any more of that snake root. Never know when we might need it again." Martha nodded, remembering the small bundle of medicine Elena had pressed into her hand. She kept it in their kitchen cabinet, wrapped carefully in clean cloth, not just as protection against future snake bites, but as a reminder of the night when two women from different worlds had worked together to hold life steady against the forces that would steal it away. In the distance the church bell chimed 3 times, marking another peaceful afternoon in their small corner of the territory. But Martha would always remember the urgency of that morning bell, counting out the minutes of a crisis that had tested everything she thought she knew about trust, healing, and the unexpected places where wisdom could be found. If you'd like more stories like this, stay a while. I'll tell the next one tomorrow night.